Hey there, guys. So, some of you, especially those of you who read the blog, know about this. I write not only about the projects that we have, but write about a couple of other things that I've been researching and looking at. One of the big ones is a game called National Pastime. I've done some videos about it in the past, but in case you don't know about this, National Pastime was a game that was published in December 1930 by a guy named Clifford Van Beek up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. This is what happens when I don't have notes. He published it over in Green Bay. He had created this game, I believe, over the course of several years. This is really the precursor of all statistics-based baseball games, i.e. Tabletop simulators, which are, of course, the precursor for all computer simulations, and frankly, also for the tabletop simulations of all sports. I'm not aware of any game quite like this that precedes National Pastime. If you know of anything, let me know. There have been sort of dice baseball games, but usually those games do not include any sort of card that would replicate players' real-life statistics. People have commented before and said, oh, well, there was the old spinner game, Ethan Allen All-Star Baseball. That didn't come out until several years after National Pastime was released. National Pastime is extremely obscure. I'm only aware, I think there are maybe 2 copies of it out there. I don't know if they're both complete. I mean, there's so few of these out there that it boggles the mind, which is why it's fun to research. The reason why we know about it is because a boy named J. Richard Seitz purchased at least 1 copy of this game. I think he may have had 2 and started 2 leagues with his friends. It started with 1, and then he had a second draft league as well, and spent most of his free time playing this game, and eventually turned it into what we know as APBA, which of course is the precursor for Strat-O-Matic and the precursor for everything else that came afterwards. So that's the reason why we're talking about this and why this is so interesting. Now, I've looked through this. I've read everything I could find that's been published about National Pastime. I now, thanks to a very kind reader, and I believe also a watcher of these videos, I do have copies of these cards and boards, or at least of the reprinted versions. And I've noticed that very few people have done like a real in-depth look at this to try to figure out how Clifford Van Beek created what he created. There are problems with National Pastime. The biggest problem is that so the old story is that Clifford Van Beek just used the Sporting News baseball guide to create the cards, which of course is impossible. There was no Sporting News baseball guide in 1930 or 1931. The game was originally advertised before the Christmas season, so in early December 1930, but it's based theoretically upon 1930 player statistics. Now, whether that's true or not is really, really up for debate, and it becomes really complicated. And it becomes especially complicated when we look at strikeouts. So we're going to go take a look at how strikeouts work in National Pastime and see what we can do. I'll put a link to this blog post down below. I happen to have a spreadsheet that includes all National Pastime cards and all results. We're using the cards and results that were printed. We're not at this point coming up with possible alternatives or ways to make up for what we think are errors in the card numbers. There are a couple of numbers in the cards that are obviously incorrect. But we're not going to handle that right now. We want to look at what was actually printed and see what we can figure out from that, just so you know. What we care about is play result number 13. So the way the National Pastime works is exactly the same as how NPIII works. If you've been watching any of those videos, somebody out there is watching these somewhere. So you have a bunch of boards, and you have the cards, and you roll a dice, 2 die, and you combine the numbers. So the way that we usually play it is the red die goes first, and then the white die goes next, and that's how you read it. Back when National Pastime was created, you had 1 large die and 1 small die. They were both white. I guess nobody dyed their die back then. Go figure that one out. But the large die would be read first, then the small die would be read second. And so either way, you have numbers that are combined. A lot of people have thought that this combination of numbers is like the APBA way of doing things. It turns out that many of the dice baseball games that were predecessors to National Pastime used a similar system, except they would use 3 different die of equal size, and then whichever number was, I believe, lowest would be the first one, so it would read lowest, medium, then highest. I think that I got that right. It might be backwards. You have to go back and see what I wrote before. See, when I wrote it down, I know I have it right. Now I'm just going off the top of my head. Anyway, so what happens is you read the colored die and the white die, or you read the big die, then the small die, and that gives you a total of 36 possible outcomes. And those are then led matrixed really to a bunch of play result numbers. You take the play result number, look at the playing board, and you come up with a result. That's the way the game works. Really kind of a complicated design, especially in the late 1920s when there were no computers around, and we're kind of just coming up with this. I think it's really quite impressive. This is much more impressive than any of the dice baseball games that came out before this, and I'm really kind of impressed that Clifford Van Beek was able to come up with something this complex. Now, number 13 is important because number 13 is always a strikeout on every single board. And so when we see number 13, we know that this corresponds somehow to the strikeouts, that number of strikeouts the players had in real life. And so when we're trying to figure out how he allocated strikeouts to batters, we can look at the 13s and compare these 13s with the 1930 statistics. Now, I've said on a prior video that I thought for at least a while that Clifford Van Beek may have used 1929 statistics. I'm going to have to back off of this, and I know that there are people on the APBA Between the Lines boards who are upset with me for daring to change my point of view. The reason why you have to back off with this is because it is obvious that the lineups and rosters are based on the 1930 season. In fact, Clifford Van Beek's lineups are so accurate that I strongly suspect that he followed with day-to-day box scores. Aha, you say, so that's how he knows how many strikeouts each player has, but there's a problem. Box scores before really the 1970s, I think, did not include batters' strikeouts or batters' walks. In 1930, no box scores include this. It doesn't matter what source you look at because they all come from the same APBA or box scores. You can go look, you can go and dig, and you will discover that we don't have batters' strikeouts and walks for the season from the box scores themselves. They had to be recalculated when this information was deemed necessary back when the Baseball Encyclopedia was published, right, 1969. So that's a big part of what the work was in going through that. And this is also, by the way, a reason why RetroSheet eventually became a thing, to try to dig deeper and get more acceptable answers. So that's the problem that we talk about here. Now, the real problem that we have with Clifford Van Beek is that there's not even a pattern, right? So here's a look at what that spreadsheet I was telling you about looks like. I have it here. I'm going to upload this very, very soon up to the blog. So those who are paying subscribers will be able to pull this down. You can play with it yourself, see what I did right and see what I did wrong. I went and grabbed the games played, number of at-bats, strikeouts, and walks for every single player, all 288 carded players. Hopefully these are right. I may have made a mistake here and there. But the real difficult thing, and I'm going through the box scores and stuff like that, the difficult thing is figuring out how those strikeout numbers must be allocated. Why not use plate appearances? Because Van Beek didn't have them, but he did have number of at-bats and number of walks, theoretically. Now, whether he had numbers of walks or not is actually also up for question, and in a couple of days we'll talk about that as well. Now, this is where the problem lies. So we can go through this and do a quick formula and estimate the number of 13s that should be on each card. Right? But the problem that we have is that it's a mess. The number of 13s estimated and the number of 13s received are way off, like way off. So we'll look at an example. Paul Easterling had a really bad year for the Tigers in 1930. He had 79 at-bats and he struck out 18 times. 87 total plate appearances, or estimated plate appearances. We think he needs to have 13 results to equal that. But guess what? He has only 2. 1, 2. So his card has nothing to do with what he did in real life, right? Paul Easterling, I'm kind of curious to see what kind of player was this guy in real life. Oh, look at this. He didn't even play in 1929, so it can't be based on his 1929 statistics. And in 1928, he struck out more often. He did have a few more plate appearances, but this is also not 2 13s. You can tell that just by looking at it, right? He should have quite a few 13s to equal this. And look, in 1938, eventually, he had 8 plate appearances, struck out twice. So there you go. He gets the Joey Gallo Award. He only had 2 13s, which is an issue. I even went and looked at his 1929 minor league statistics with Beaumont and the Texas League. Here he is down here. What you can see from this is he struck out how many? 99 times. 99 times in 562 at-bats, right? And so when we look at this, we would have estimated that he would need about 613 results on his card to keep that ratio where it needs to be. This guy used to only like to strike out a lot. Instead, he only got the 2 13s. Now, my numbers might be off. You can redo the calculations, write them down below. Let's go talk about it. Let's look at another one. This is Fred McGuire of the Boston Braves, 31 years old. He had 22 strikeouts, 516 at-bats, and 20 walks. I thought that he should have 113 and maybe could be bumped up to a second one. McGuire, however, ends up with 3. 34 and 35 are 13s, and 45 is also a 13. It's a similar problem, and you kind of really scratch your head about this, trying to figure out how exactly this happened. Because we're not rounding up once, we're rounding up twice, right? And I don't know what's going on. Now, there could be an argument that maybe a 34 or 35 13 could be an error, but the truth is other players have both 13s on 34 and on 35. He's the only player who has it on both numbers, but both of those are certainly numbers that are demonstrated as possibly having play result number 13. So we can't go and say, oh, this is clearly an error, let's go change it. Right. The last one that we have here is the pitcher, Dutch Henry of the White Sox. Now, the pitchers, as you can imagine, are a little bit crazy. Henry should have received 6 13s, we think. He had 51 at-bats, struck out 15 times, walked 5 times. Well, go take a look at this. And what you'll see is that he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 13s on his card. So sometimes the model is off. We're close, we're 1 off. Sometimes the model's further off, and sometimes the model is way off, right? What that tells us is that there's probably not an error with the calculation. It's probably that what we think would have determined the 13 is not actually what Clifford Van Beek did. Now, what did he do? I don't know yet, but I know that this isn't what he did. So we'll look at this a little bit later on and see if we can't figure out some sort of pattern eventually. It is actually kind of important and kind of powerful to know that, well, this theory that we had, at least about the 13, is not necessarily correct. Now, what we'll talk about in 2 days is play result number 14, and we'll probably find a similar issue with play result number 14, and that might give us a little bit more insight into what Van Beek maybe actually did to create his game. So interesting stuff and fun to play around with, but there's no doubt in my mind that he did not have the walk and strikeout numbers for 1930. Find out more later. Talk to you again then. Bye.